Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of A.IdlePodcast, the podcast where I do a weekly book review. This week, I read A Lesson Before Dying by Ernest J. This story is of the character Jefferson, a black man who was convicted of killing a white store owner. This is set on the Henry Pickett sugar cane plantation in Louisiana in the late 1940s. Now, it's referred to as a plantation throughout the book, but obviously, if we're looking at time periods, slavery was abolished long before then. So I just kind of inferred that because the people that live there, the black people specifically, that are still on that land probably just refer to it because that's the way that their parents and grandparents and so on refer to it because they are the descendants of slaves. Now, this story is less of an explanation of the alleged crime, and it's more on the implications that it has on the people around everyone involved. If you're looking for some idea of what this can align to, it's very similar to Kill a Mockingbird, which was released in 1960, as well as The Green Mile, released in 1996. Now, it mirrors To Kill a Mockingbird in the sense that we're following the trial of a black man that is basically up on trial unjustly. And so we're following that process. Whereas with The Green Mile, we kind of see this whole journey to death, that the decision has been made, and now we're just kind of waiting to get to that point, that ending point. Now, the unique thing about this book is that we're able to, as an audience, discover a time where black people were kind of in a limbo in between the sharecropping phase of the early 1900s and then the civil rights movement, which, we all know didn't happen until the late 1950s, 1960s. So we're kind of in this weird area where black people don't have civil liberties at all, but they have some type of freedom. So the people that are on this land are working it, but we can again infer that they're not being really paid that much. And if you aren't familiar with sharecropping, I would definitely take just a few minutes to just Google it, and you'll find out that it's really not that much different than slavery. It's just kind of the legal way of doing things. But anyway, this book was released in 1993, and it is Gaines's 8th novel. It earned him a Pulitzer Prize nomination, and it was adapted into a film with Mekhi Phifer and Don Cheadle. If you're interested, it is on YouTube for free. Someone just uploaded it. I was gonna watch the film, but I did not, because it starts out with the incident that kind of catapulted this whole plot, and I just didn't need any more trauma. So eventually I'll watch it, but it is on YouTube if you want to do a comparison. Now, this is loosely based on the Willie Francis story, which is a young black man that was set to be executed in 1945, but it was a botched execution, and it did not go through. And so he actually lived through that horrific experience, but he was executed in 1947. So if you're interested in that story, definitely Google that as well. Now, this book is kind of giving us the narrative from Grant Wiggins' perspective. In this, we see that the tone is very defiant and it lacks a lot of contentment. It's not really a bitter tone, but it's not happy by any means. And you'll see why as you discover the character of Grant Wiggins throughout this book. Now, it is told in flashbacks as well as framed memories. So it's almost like we're experiencing the story after the fact, which is good because it gives the characters a little bit more time to reflect on their actions. But we can see that we have a lot of times where Grant is recalling something that had happened, and it seems like he's talking like it was the other day. So we're not really getting the story in real time. We're getting it after the fact. The story does change perspectives and tone briefly towards the end. And I will say that Gaines definitely encompassed the different characters through their storytelling or even their writing. There is a point where we get an entire chapter that is narrated by the journal of Jefferson. And that was probably the toughest chapter to get through, if I'm being really honest. I got really choked up towards the end. But you see that the language changes in that chapter. The way that he is seeing things, it changes because we're in a whole different character. So you do get a little bit of that, but for the most part, we're seeing this story through the voice of Grant. And the book is it's under 260 pages, and it is 31 chapters long. So this is not by any means a long read. You can certainly get through it quite easily. Now, before we get into my themes, I do want to say that because this is a similar book to Kill a Mockingbird, and that's one of the books that are always taught in the English classes, and so there's themes that are expected for us to pull out of it. I don't have racism or segregation as one of my themes here. I don't even really have education, even though I'm going to touch on all of these topics, because I think that that's a very surface level, you know? If you really pay attention to what's happening in the narrative, then you know that there's clearly more going on than this just being a racist town. Like, what is happening here? What are the characters feeling? And so on. So if you were expecting me to say that the theme is racism, I'm not going to say that because to me, if you really think about it, it's less of that being a theme and more of that being a setting. So initially when I'm reading the book, or even when you're reading the summary, you know it's set in the South in the late 40s. You know what that means. You know, that's the time period that is associated with that. And so I kind of look at all of that as the setting. I know where the story is being played out in. And all of that ultimately does affect the characters, but that's not the main thing that we need to be pulling from this. With that being said, the first theme I have down here is dignity. So at the beginning, we get a recap of the trial of Jefferson. And the defense, who is the person that is, you know, supposed to be carrying out the justice here and supposed to be defending Jefferson, actually says out of his mouth that Jefferson is an animal, and more specifically, he's a hog. So there's no intelligence there. He can't be held accountable for his actions. It's not that, oh, he didn't do it. It's that, look, yeah, he did it, but he's an animal, so we can't really find him guilty of this crime. And in his defense, he's catering to the white jury and their belief that Black people really are ignorant and they're really not really capable of much thought. Therefore, you know, it's like trying a dog. You can't really find them guilty of that. And so that was his whole argument of getting Jefferson off. Now, knowing what we know, Jefferson is convicted of the killing. And so he has to go to the cell, one, knowing that he didn't kill that store owner, two, knowing that his only defense, his best defense, was that he was an animal. And so this is where the struggle for dignity ultimately lies, because now we're getting this constant repetition of this phrase of make Jefferson a man. He needs to become a man before he goes to the electric chair. So when you see that phrase, when you see become a man, make him a man, teach him, all this other stuff, link that towards dignity. It's synonymous with dignity. It's the same thing. And as you read further into the book, you'll see that, but it'll help you if you're able to kind of comprehend that a little bit earlier on. You're able to see what they're talking about. That's ultimately what they mean, because when we look at the phrase, make him a man, it's very general, because one, what is a man? What they really mean is help him grasp his dignity again. He is a human being and he needs to be reminded of that. He needs to truly believe that in his heart, because he is now in this isolated situation in a jail cell, believing that he is an animal, which is terrible. So we get this whole, again, this thing where Jefferson's ability to defy the label of being a hog and acknowledge himself as a human, that's where the dignity comes into play, you know? Not accepting that label of an animal. And so this includes things like act like a man, walk to the chair with your head up high, eat with your hands, or even speak when spoken to. You're able to feel, you're able to cry, you're able to care because you are a human. And we're going to get into that a little bit more once we touch on the character of Jefferson. But these are the ways that we can differentiate between what a human is and what an animal is. Now, speaking of defy, the second theme I have here is defiance. And we're not talking about defying the odds, because if it wasn't abundantly clear by now, this is not the story of, oh, we're going to get justice for this person that was wrong. That's not this story at all. That's actually out of the question. No one even questions the verdict, even though there's a large group of people who know it wasn't necessarily just. We're really speaking on characters defying other characters. So, for example, Grant refuses the hospitality from Inez, the maid, and that is the maid of the Pickett family, the Henry Pickett family. This is him defying that family and kind of the hierarchy of citizenship, because he was only able to enter the house through the back door, through the kitchen, and he refuses to sit down or accept coffee because he really doesn't want to be there, and he doesn't want to be treated like someone that's less than. In return, though, we see that on another visit, Pickett defies Grant by requesting his presence at 5 p.m., not coming out to talk to him until 8:15. And that is right there an act of humiliation. He's trying to put him in his place, essentially. Why is he trying to do that? Well, Grant has a lot of pride. And when we're talking about pride in this town, that really comes from education. So for Grant, his education is a symbol of his pride. He was able to attain a higher education experience, and what we find is education is actually synonymous with being a human being. That means you're eligible of respect because you have a background, you're able to speak correctly. And to a lot of the white people in this town, Black people acquiring education creates resentment, because it's like, oh, now we have to actually treat them like they are something, like they're worth something. And it's kind of knocking down that whole mantra that Black people aren't really good for anything but work in the fields, which we have to still understand that that's kind of what they were still doing in this time period. They weren't slaves, but they were out cutting the sugar cane. There was a lot of dialogue about the children that Grant teaches in the school having to cut their school year short so they can go home and work for the family. And so white people are seeing these people as working, literal laborers, and that's it. Now that they're breaking this ceiling and attaining this education, it's creating a lot of resentment. However, it's creating resentment on both sides. We see this in the treatment that Grant receives from both white people as well as Reverend Ambrose, who is a Black reverend and kind of like the Black reverend in this town. You know, the white people don't like when Grant talks, with correct grammar and things like that. And it's very obvious that they have a distaste for him and a need to kind of always put him in his place and remind him of who he is and that he is a Black man in this town. But also a lot of Black people kind of resent Grant as well, because it probably has a lot to do with envy and them wanting to get out of the town as well, or learn something more than the sugar canes or anything like that. But I think it's a little bit of an inferiority complex, which it's almost like it kind of is real, because everyone is upholding this, because you're saying by feeling inferior to Grant because he has education and you don't, you are saying that person is above you. And so everyone's kind of agreeing to uphold this hierarchy where it's the white citizens are up here, the mixed citizens are kind of down here, and that whole idea of colorism comes into play. And then the fully black, dark-skinned citizens are at the very bottom. But if you're lucky enough to kind of get that education, it bumps you up just a little bit, but you're still black, So it's interesting to see that resentment being created on all sides, and it's not really coming from one specific area. And so Grant kind of has it really bad, It's almost like, where do you find a friend in that situation? Now, when I was talking about language and verbiage, that actually is kind of a sneaky theme in this book. And that is because you wouldn't really think about it, but when you pay attention to the dialogue that these characters are having, using correct grammar and proper words in the right space, that does combat the ignorance that is assigned with being black. So that's the way that we can tell that Grant is rubbing people the wrong way. He mentally corrects himself and dumbs himself down to not stir up any trouble, so that he doesn't seem like he's trying to be a smartass, even though that's just the way he talks now because he knows better. One cool kind of piece that, if you do read this book, I would like for everyone to pay attention to is the fact that when Grant has conversations with Jefferson, he repeatedly uses his name. Whether that's him just, being a normal person and referring to Jefferson as Jefferson, it's almost a little too much. And I'm pretty sure that was his way of reminding Jefferson that he is a person, that he has a story, he has a history, and he has people around him that still care for him, and not allowing him to completely shut that out. And lastly, when it comes to language, Sam Guidry, which I believe is the sheriff, it's one of those pack of powerful white men in this town. He actually says, "I'd rather see a contented hog go to the chair than an aggravated hog." So if we're looking at language, again, there's that word hog, but then he's not really giving Jefferson a chance for redemption at all. His worry is whether or not he's going to be content or aggravated. He's opposing Grant's teachings in that he's dismissing that Jefferson can be made a man at all. And he's denying Jefferson that dignity in the same instance. For him, it's all about getting him to the electric chair smoothly and with no fuss, so that it doesn't cause any problems for him. So just recognizing that in his eyes, he's already condemned to the hell, that where animals go to. I don't know. And last theme I want to touch on is respectability. This comes in the form of, and it may be due to the time period, where manners were expected and there was a clear deference to elders. So you always, open the door for the elders, or made sure they were okay, or, spoke when you walked into a room, things like that. But also for Grant, it comes with him upholding the respect he has for himself. And that comes in the form of a very specific quote where he says to his aunt, "Everything you sent me to school for, you're stripping me of it by sending him to those jail visits and sending him to teach Jefferson, because he's going to the jail. One, that's not a pleasant experience as is, but going there and being searched like you are a criminal, being treated like you are doing something wrong when you're just trying to help, is ultimately everything that he wants to avoid, and could have been the motivation behind going to college and getting a better education, to avoid situations like this. And so putting him in a position to be humiliated over and over and over again really wears on the respect that he has for himself. And that contributes to a lot of the issues that he has within his own mind. And since we're talking on Grant, I want to get into his character a little bit. So if I had to say one word that would describe Grant Wiggins, it would be disillusioned. And by definition, that just means that a loss of one's ideals, or disenchanted, which is quite literally what happened to Grant once he went away to college. We don't really have much of an explanation as to why, but he just lost his faith in God. He has a terrible attitude, and that's ultimately, I would say a reflection of his internal struggle. He has a lot of boiling emotions, and it seems to be no outlet. You can see this in the relationship that he has with everyone around him. It's very strained. It seems like people are walking on eggshells around him, and he doesn't really ever have a pleasant conversation outside of his love interest. When it comes to education, again, he has a college degree, and he is referred to as professor by those that respect him, and he's a teacher. But his most popular mode of teaching, it seems, is tough love. He does want the kids to learn, but he's very strict on them. He also resents having to teach Jefferson at the same time. The irony in all of this is that he's accomplished more than many and probably accomplished the dream that a lot of people wish they had access to, but he seems to be the least happy of all of them. And so I thought of the phrase ignorance is bliss. Maybe if he wouldn't have gone to school at all, maybe he would be a little bit happier, but that's completely debatable. But I felt like that really applied to him. I think he just has a lot on his mind, and he's not able to fully comprehend it because there's just a lot coming at him. So when it comes to Grant, it's difficult to nail down what exactly he does believe in. He really doesn't believe in himself, if we're being completely honest. He doesn't believe in God. He's explicitly stated that he doesn't really like education. Maybe he believes in love, but even his relationship with Vivian seems to have a breakdown, and we have no clear conclusion to that, as opposed to Jefferson, who is someone who has seemingly accepted his fate right off the bat, much like everyone else. But he's strong-willed. He is refusing to participate in the charade of turning his life over to God in the last few weeks of his life in order to get to heaven, or caving into the Reverend's demands, well, not demands, but his urging for him to read a Bible or listen to gospel music or do whatever it is to make his afterlife as pleasant as possible. But also, Jefferson is more intelligent than people give him credit for, because he's able to, one, separate the symptoms of being a hog versus a human. There's a lot of discussion on whether or not he actually believes that he is an animal himself, but he's able to, he knows the difference between speaking to someone, that being a human, obviously you have a name, you're eating with your hands, stuff like that it's obvious, but he displays the action of a hog with the intention of preventing further mental anguish. That to me is a sign of high emotional intelligence, because again, we know he's going to death. No one's fighting for him to be, let free of the jail at this point. Everyone knows that he is going to be put to death. And in his mind, in order to stop any more pain from coming in, he's just going to conform to that label that was given to him in that courtroom, which was that of an animal. And so in all of this, it seems like he's given up and he's accepting, whatever comes his way. But I really look at it as him trying to protect himself further. Everyone thinks that they know what's good for him. His godmother believing it religion, Grant believing it. I don't know what Grant believes is going to help him, because he really didn't want to be involved in it anyway. But for him, it was just the comfort of, hey, I got this label. They already believe it. It's not like they're going to change their minds. Let me just run with this. Let me be someone who doesn't interact with anyone else, and just let me go. Let me die. Let me be done with this. So when we first start reading this book, the expectations or the stakes are set that we're eventually going to get a completion of Jefferson and Grant's character arcs. How do we know it's going to be completed? Well, that's determined by the law in the story, God, the internal acknowledgments of the characters, other characters, as well as us, the audience. Again, there is no expectation of innocence, unfortunately. So what we find is that Jefferson does have a complete character arc. He eventually does become a man, quote unquote, and he walks to the chair with his head held high and acknowledging that, he's a human, and He's not an animal. He's intelligent and he's not stupid. Grant, however, I've been wrestling with this because there wasn't really a character arc to complete for Grant. I don't think we really got anything more than just peeling back the layers on him and just gathering more information on him, because I don't really think he's learned anything. Towards the end of the book, we do see him get really emotional for like the first time, but nothing else really changes. There's no come to Jesus moment, literally. There's no like proposal or anything. That he doesn't run off with Vivian into the sunset. He doesn't move out of state to teach somewhere else. There's no conclusion for him. So we don't really get any type of closure when it comes to Grant. But with Jefferson, he did give us a lot of information in his journal entries, which again is, for me, it was the most emotional part of the book. And it's interesting because it doesn't even include like the tough details, like talking about the murder or anything like that. It's just his description of his life up until his death was kind of tough to read. So we did get that closure from Jefferson, but not for Grant. I will say that this was quite a good read. I don't know why it's not as popular as A To Kill a Mockingbird, because I feel like it's very comparable, but it also gives you a deeper dive into things. I think that there are a lot of stories on injustice, and if you turn on the news, there's even more stories on injustice, but this gives a good idea of how it affects the people around that, all of those people involved. And that's important because those are the people that are going to carry on whatever legacy that is, whether that's a legacy of pain and hurt, or it's a legacy that creates opportunities for other people in the future. And that's important because, you know, that's the difference between passing trauma down or passing hope down. I will say that there is an excellent monologue in here by Grant on page 166 to 167. And it is excellent. It's on essentially Black pain and Black patriarchy. And that might not be exactly the right word to describe it, but just Black people being the head of the Black community and how much stress and trauma that puts on, you know, Black men. I thought that was probably the best thing that I've read all month. It was great. And maybe I'll post that somewhere or do a short video and read it out so everyone can hear it. But I thought that was a very relevant and very well written monologue from Grant. So all in all, I mean, I think this is a good read. I certainly think it's one of those things to have, you know, in the back of your mind, just to give you more information on this time period, a different perspective on the time period. I certainly think that if you've read To Kill a Mockingbird, this is an excellent follow-up piece to that. And the only takeaway I have for this book is a quote by W.C. Fields, which I'm sure we have all heard before. It's not what they call you, but it's what you answer to. With that being said, thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of A.IdlePodcast. Next week, I have no idea what I'm going to be reviewing. I know that I will be reading The 13 American Arguments as well as Big Little Lies. Those are the two books that I'm reading right now. So more than likely, I'll be reviewing one of those next week. If you have any suggestions, you can always reach out to me on Twitter or Instagram or email. Everything is in the description box of the YouTube video. Thank you again. I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend. Stay safe, and I'll see you next week.